The wind howled as the train screeched to a halt in the dusty town of Ash Bluff, Montana. Clara Whitmore sat rigidly on the hard bench seat, her gloved hands clutching a worn carpet bag and a leather bound Bible as though they could anchor her to the ground she was about to step onto. She had never been so far from home. Then again, she hadn't had a home in a long time. Raised in a convent after the death of her parents from a winter illness when she was just 7, Clara had spent most of her life within stone walls and silent halls. The nuns had been kind in their way, but the rules were strict, the days long, and the future always bleak for girls like her. When she turned 21, the convent could keep her no longer. With no family, no dowry, and no real skills beyond embroidery and prayer, Clara had been sent into a world that had no place for her, and so she'd done something desperate, answered a mail-order bride advertisement. The letter had come from a man named Daniel McCrae, widower, rancher, father of one. His handwriting was square and plain, the words practical. I seek a good woman, kind-hearted and honest, to help raise my daughter and keep house. I offer a home, security, and mutual respect. Love may come or may not, but I will treat you fair. It wasn't the language of poetry, but there had been a dignity to it. Clara had prayed for guidance and felt nothing, not a sign, not a whisper. Just silence and a growing weight in her chest that told her staying in Boston was no longer an option. The merchant her guardian had arranged for her to marry Mr. Imus Callahan, twice her age and smelling of vinegar, had made it clear he wanted an obedient wife and little more. His eyes had always lingered too long, his compliments laced with suggestion. Clara had seen her future then, a life of subjugation, fear, and children born into a loveless household. So she had boarded the westbound train under a borrowed name. With trembling hands and a soul full of fear. Now, stepping off the train onto the cracked wooden platform, Clara blinked against the sunlight and the swirling dust. Everything was brown dirt, buildings, even the mountains in the distance. There were no towering cathedrals here, no crowded marketplaces. Just endless sky and strangers. What if he was cruel? What if his daughter hated her? What if she couldn't keep up with the demands of ranch life? She had never so much as saddled a horse, let alone cleaned a chicken coop or mended a fence. Her boots were new and stiff, the hem of her dress already dusty. And what of the marriage bed? Heat rose to her cheeks at the thought. Clara was untouched, completely innocent of the ways of intimacy. The nuns had spoken of it only in hushed warnings, with downcast eyes. Marriage was sacred, but the flesh was a danger. She didn't know what to expect, only that the unknown terrified her. The crowd on the platform began to thin. Families greeting loved ones, ranch hands collecting cargo. Clara stood alone, a solitary figure with wide blue eyes and a heart pounding against her ribs. She tried to steady her breath, tried to remember the song she had whispered on the train. When I am afraid, I will trust in thee. Then she saw him, tall and broad-shouldered, with a well-worn hat pulled low over his eyes. Daniel McCrae approached with a gait that spoke of long days in the saddle and years carved by grief. He wasn't a young man mid-30s, perhaps, but there was strength in the way he carried himself, and something unreadable in his expression. Beside him was a small girl, no more than 5, with tangled brown curls and a worn rag doll clutched to her chest. She clung to Daniel's hand and stared at Clara with open curiosity. Clara's knees wobbled. She had come all this way, risked everything, and yet, as Daniel tipped his hat and said, "Miss Whitmore?" her throat closed up. Her body wanted to flee, but her feet wouldn't move. "Yes," she managed at last, her voice no louder than a whisper. "I'm Clara." And with that, the journey truly began, not just across the plains, but into the unknown corners of her own heart. Daniel McCrae wasn't a man of many words. He'd written to Clara Whitmore out of necessity, not romance. It had been 2 years since his wife, Mary, passed away in childbirth, leaving him to raise their daughter alone while managing a demanding cattle ranch on the outskirts of Ash Bluff, Montana. Between the droughts, broken fences, and long rides across open land, there simply wasn't time or space for grief anymore, but the house was too quiet. His little girl needed more than just a father who came in at dusk, exhausted and silent. She needed warmth, softness, things Daniel no longer knew how to give. So when he penned that letter, it was with practical hopes. He needed a woman who could be a mother to his daughter, keep the house from falling into ruin, and bring stability back into their lives. He wasn't prepared for Clara Whitmore when he saw her standing on the platform, small, pale and fragile-looking in a stiff gray traveling dress. His gut clenched. She looked like she'd break if the wind blew too hard. Her eyes were too big for her face, and she clutched her bag like it was the only solid thing in her world. Daniel had expected someone sturdier, less frightened. This girl looked like she didn't belong here at all. Still, he'd given his word, and Daniel McCrae was a man who kept his promises. Miss Whitmore? He asked, tipping his hat, squinting beneath the wide brim against the afternoon sun. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm Clara. He offered her a brief nod and stepped aside. This here's my daughter, Lottie. The little girl peeked out from behind his leg, clutching her rag doll. She wore a faded dress and her curls were tangled from the wind. She studied Clara for a long moment, silent and serious. Then, surprising them both, she stepped forward and reached up to take Clara's hand. Clara froze. The little hand in hers was warm, and somehow that tiny gesture, the trust of a child, loosened something in her chest. She crouched to Lottie's level and managed a soft smile. Hello there. Daniel watched the exchange with unreadable eyes. He was grateful Lottie hadn't taken to crying or clinging, but it only added to his doubts. Clara was clearly out of her depth, and he didn't want to overwhelm her, but the truth was, the arrangement required immediate action. You must be tired, he said gruffly, breaking the moment. Wagons over there. It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch. Clara followed without protest, though her hands trembled as she climbed into the high seat. Daniel noticed the way she kept glancing around the mountains, the endless prairie, the clouds stretching across a sky too big for someone raised between stone walls. He wondered what stories she'd left behind, and whether she'd regret coming west before they even reached the ranch. The ride was quiet. Clara tried to ask a few polite questions, but Daniel's answers were brief and factual. He wasn't trying to be rude, he just didn't know how to talk to someone like her. Her voice was too soft, her posture too proper. She smelled like lavender soap and city air. When they arrived, the homestead stood lonely and simple against the hills, one main house with a sagging porch, a chicken coop, and a small barn in need of paint. Clara took it all in with wide eyes, but said nothing. Inside, the house was clean, but worn. The kitchen held a wood-burning stove, a dented kettle, and shelves lined with chipped plates. A single photograph of Mary sat above the fireplace, a younger Daniel beside a dark-haired woman, smiling in a way he hadn't since the day she died. Daniel watched Clara see the photo. She didn't comment. I cleared out the spare room, he said. You'll sleep there. Once the wedding's done, we can talk about moving you into the main room. Her face paled. The wedding. Tomorrow? He nodded. Pastor will be here by noon. Lottie needs a mother, Miss Whitmore. I need a partner. No pressure to anything else. Not yet. But the law's the law. She swallowed hard, and for a moment he thought she might change her mind and run dot, but then Lottie tugged on Clara's skirt and whispered, Do you know how to braid hair? Clara blinked, her lip trembling slightly. Yes, I do. Lottie beamed. Will you braid mine tomorrow? For the wedding? Clara looked at Daniel, then down at the little girl. Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, yes, but something else too. Hope. I'd like that, she whispered. And just like that, the decision was made, not with a contract, but with a child's question. The morning sun rose slowly over the hills, casting golden light through the dusty window panes of the McCrae homestead. Clara sat on the edge of the bed in the spare room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her traveling trunk sat at the foot of the bed, unopened. She hadn't touched her belongings beyond removing a single nightgown, which now lay neatly folded over the end rail. In a few hours, she would be a married woman. A wife. A stepmother. The words felt foreign in her mind, too big to belong to her. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but she forced herself to breathe deeply and listen to the sounds of the house, the muffled clatter of pans in the kitchen, the low murmur of Daniel's voice as he spoke to Lottie. Part of her wanted to run, to take her bag and flee into the open land, as far away from marriage and expectations as the train tracks would carry her. But something stopped her. Not fear, at least not the old kind. Not anymore. There was something about this place, this child, and even this quiet, guarded man that had stirred something long buried in Clara's soul. Still, she didn't understand it, and she wasn't sure she trusted it either. The door creaked open, and little Lottie padded into the room in her bare feet, wearing a faded blue dress and clutching her rag doll under one arm. Her curls were wild, her eyes wide and curious. Clara sat up straighter, startled. "Good morning," she said gently. Lottie didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked up beside Clara, stared at her for a moment, and then asked in a small, serious voice, "Can you be Mama now?" The words landed with a weight Clara wasn't prepared for. She blinked, heart suddenly pounding, and searched the girl's face. There was no guile there, no hesitation, just a raw, innocent question from a child who had lost more than someone her age should have. Clara felt her throat tighten. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Lottie hugged her doll to her chest. "I had a mama. She went to heaven. Papa says you're going to be his wife, so? Can you be Mama too?" Clara sat in stunned silence for a moment. She had no idea what she'd expected her role to be here. Helper, housekeeper, companion, maybe. But not mother. Not right away. And certainly not to a child who still remembered the scent and lullabies of her real mama. "I don't know if I'll be very good at it," Clara admitted softly. "I've never been a mama before." Lottie shrugged, matter of fact. "I never had one like you before either. But you're nice. And you smiled when you looked at me yesterday. That's more than anyone else does." The child's voice cracked just a little at the end, and something inside Clara melted completely. She reached out slowly and tucked a wild curl behind Lottie's ear. "I'll try," she whispered. "If you'll help me learn." Lottie nodded solemnly, then, without warning, climbed up onto the bed and crawled into Clara's lap, curling into her like a kitten. Clara stiffened at first, unsure of what to do with the small, warm weight against her chest. But her arms moved on instinct, wrapping around the girl, holding her close. For a moment, Clara closed her eyes and simply breathed. She remembered the ache of being alone in the world. She remembered crying in the night and no one coming. She remembered praying for anyone to take her hand and promise she'd be okay. Now, someone had asked her to be that person, not because of duty, but because of need, because of love. Later that morning, Clara braided Lottie's hair carefully, parting it down the middle and weaving the strands with quiet focus. Lottie beamed into the cracked mirror, proud of the ribbon Clara had tied at the ends. Daniel watched from the doorway, arms folded across his chest, something unreadable on his face. He'd expected resistance, maybe detachment, but instead, Clara had leaned in. "She looks happy," he said. Clara nodded, smoothing the girl's collar. "She asked me to be her mama." Daniel straightened, surprised. She did? Yes, and I told her I'd try. Their eyes met. For the first time, Daniel truly looked at Clara not as a stranger or a girl too delicate for ranch life, but as someone who might actually belong here. Maybe. Just maybe, they were all trying together, and that was enough for today. Clara McCrae. The name still felt like a costume she hadn't quite grown into. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she'd stood under the cottonwood tree behind the McCrae homestead, hands trembling in a borrowed white dress, and said, "I do," to a man she barely knew. The ceremony had been brief, quiet, just the pastor, Lottie, and a single ranch hand as witness, but it had changed everything. Now she was a wife, a mother. In name, if not yet by instinct, and a rancher's helpmate, which, Clara was quickly learning, meant far more than baking bread and mending socks. Her first real lesson came the morning Daniel woke her at dawn with a knock on the bedroom door. "We lost a calf in the night," he said through the wood. "Need your help." She had dressed quickly in her plainest dress, boots 2 sizes too big, and a thick shawl against the early chill. The sun hadn't yet crested the hills, and frost still clung to the grass. Clara followed Daniel out to the pasture, heart-hammering, unsure of what help she could possibly offer. The calf had wandered from its mother and gotten caught in a tangle of brush and wire. Clara stood frozen for a moment, staring at the poor creature, its legs trembling, eyes wide with panic. "You okay?" Daniel asked, already slipping off his gloves. She wasn't, but she nodded. He showed her how to hold the calf's head gently, how to talk low to keep it calm. Her hands shook as she touched it, soft, warm, breathing, but she did as she was told. They worked together in silence, freeing it slowly and carefully. When it finally stumbled back toward its mother, Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Daniel looked at her with a hint of surprise. "You didn't faint." "I thought I might," she admitted with a small smile. "But I didn't." And that was how it began. Every day brought something new. Gathering eggs without cracking them. Learning how to knead dough without overworking it. Hanging wash in the wind so it didn't end up in the dirt. Clara had never worked this hard in her life, and her muscles ached in places she didn't know existed. But there was a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of it, sunrise to sunset. Hands busy, mind occupied. At night, when Lottie curled against her side with heavy eyes and whispered stories about the chickens or the stars, Clara felt something warm and unfamiliar take root. Not comfort, exactly, but belonging. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was Daniel. He was kind, always, respectful, protective of her in his quiet, stoic way. But he kept his distance, like a man standing in a doorway, unsure whether to enter. At first, Clara thought he didn't care. Then she realized he cared too much and didn't know how to show it. There were moments, though, like when she burned the cornbread and muttered a curse under her breath, and he let out the smallest laugh, just one quiet puff of amusement. But it felt like music, or when she slipped on wet stone outside the barn, and before she hit the ground, he was there, one strong arm catching her waist. His hand lingered just a second too long, his eyes flickering with something like concern. Or want. They said little about it. But Clara felt it. One evening, they sat on the porch while Lottie chased fireflies in the yard. The air smelled of fresh-cut hay and coming rain. Clara was mending Daniel's shirt, an old tear at the elbow, while he sipped coffee, watching the sky. "You don't complain," he said suddenly. She looked up. "About what?" "Any of it." "The work." "The dirt. Me." Clara paused. What would be the point? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost gruffly, he added, "You're stronger than I thought." She smiled, just a little. "So am I." He met her eyes, and this time he didn't look away. Not right away. Later that night, as she lay beside Lottie in the narrow bed, Clara thought of the girl's question from days before, "Can you be Mama now?" At the time, it had felt impossible. Now, not so much. She didn't know if she loved Daniel, not yet. But she cared. She wanted him to come home safe, to smile more often, to let her in. She wanted to be part of this land, this life, even if she had to learn the hard way. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like someone running away. She felt like someone building something new. The wind had changed. Clara noticed it before anyone else. The air felt too still, too watchful, like the prairie was holding its breath. Even the chickens were quieter than usual, and the dogs barked at the wind like it had brought something unwanted. She shook it off and kept busy. Lottie had a cough, so Clara kept her inside with warm broth and honey tea. Daniel was working the north pasture, checking the fencing. It was just another day. Until the knock came. Clara was hanging laundry when she heard it, 3 sharp raps against the front door. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and headed inside. Lottie was dozing on the cot by the hearth, wrapped in quilts. Clara gently brushed a curl from the child's forehead and opened the door. Standing there, in a fine coat and polished boots caked with trail dust, was the last man she ever wanted to see. Amos Callahan. The scent of cigar smoke and cologne hit her first. Then the eyes, dark, greedy, familiar. He looked her up and down like a man inspecting merchandise. "Miss Whitmore," he said with a smirk. "Or should I say, Mrs. McCrae?" Clara's stomach dropped. Her throat went dry. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice tight. He pushed his way slightly into the doorway. "You disappeared. Right before our engagement announcement, no less. I had to do some digging to find you. Imagine my surprise when I heard you'd hopped a train to the frontier and married some dirt farmer with a half-wild child." Clara's hands clenched. "You shouldn't be here. I've come to take you back," he said plainly. "You belong in Boston. As my wife. You had no right to run. I never agreed to marry you. You didn't have to. Your guardian did. And your signature was on the license. You stole that from me, Clara." She stepped back. "I was never yours." Callahan took a slow step forward. "You think this life suits you? Scrubbing pots and raising someone else's brat? That man of yours won't last a winter. You'll be begging to come back." A low voice cut through the room like a blade. "She won't beg you for anything." Daniel stood in the doorway behind Callahan, hat in hand, coat dusty from the trail. He'd returned early, something in his gut telling him to hurry home. Now he stepped forward, his presence filling the space like thunder before a storm. Callahan turned. "Ah, the husband." Daniel's jaw was tight, but his voice was calm. "You're trespassing. I'm here for my property." Daniel's eyes darkened. "She's not property. She's my wife. You need to leave." Callahan scoffed. "I've got legal paper signatures, proof of arrangement. The sheriff will listen to me." "Then go get the sheriff," Daniel said flatly. "But you won't speak to my wife that way again. And if you step 1 inch closer to my home, we'll see if those boots of yours are faster than my rifle." Callahan hesitated. Daniel didn't. The rancher stepped between Clara and the man, his body a wall of quiet fury. And for the first time, Clara realized that Daniel hadn't just married her for Lottie. He wasn't just tolerating her presence. He was defending her, claiming her not as duty, but as something closer to devotion. Callahan sneered. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Daniel said. And it was. Callahan left that night. He made noise in town, threatened legal action, even tried to bribe a deputy, but the pastor confirmed the marriage was lawful, and Clara swore under oath that she had never signed anything willingly. The sheriff sided with Daniel. The frontier had little patience for men who tried to buy women like cattle. The past had come to reclaim her, and she had said no. That night, Clara stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself as the stars blinked overhead. Daniel came to stand beside her, silent as always. But his presence was enough. "I thought I was going to be afraid," she said softly. "You had every right to be." She looked at him. "But I wasn't. Not when you were there." Daniel's eyes found hers in the dark. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Clara took a slow breath. "I don't think I've ever stood up to anyone before." He gave a small, proud nod. "You did today." They didn't kiss, not yet, but when Daniel reached for her hand, Clara didn't hesitate. She'd run from Boston terrified, believing she was weak. But out here, on this wild land, in a home built by calloused hands and quiet hearts, she was beginning to discover something new. She was stronger than she'd ever known. Autumn came early to Ash Bluff. The first frost dusted the fields in white. The cottonwoods turned golden, and the air smelled of wood smoke and apples. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching Lottie chase a chicken around the yard, her giggles rising into the crisp air. The laughter filled the house in a way. Clara never realized she had been longing for Dot. It had been a month since Amos Callahan had left, his threats falling away like brittle leaves in the wind. In that time, something inside Clara had shifted. Her fear, once so loud it had followed her everywhere like a shadow, had quieted. Not disappeared, but softened. Like something she could finally live alongside Dot, she had grown calluses on her palms and freckles on her cheeks. She could milk a cow without flinching, and had learned how to make bread rise even in the cold. Lottie had taken to calling her Mama without prompting now, as easily as she reached for her hand. The first time she'd said it aloud casually. As if it had always been true, Clara had excused herself and cried in the pantry. But not all changes were so easy to speak of. Daniel remained steady, kind, but careful. He thanked her when she made supper, when she sewed buttons or stayed up with Lottie's fever. He worked beside her when he could and respected her space when she needed it. They shared everything except what they both wanted most. The truth that what had begun as a practical arrangement had grown into something more. Something tender. Something real. Clara wasn't sure when she had fallen in love with him. Maybe it was the night he sat beside her for an hour, silently holding her hand after Lottie had a nightmare. Maybe it was the way he spoke to the animals like they were old friends. Maybe it was how he always made sure her tea water stayed hot on the stove. Even when he left before sunrise. He never said the words. Neither did she. Until one cold morning, when everything changed. Daniel had gone out to check the southern fence line. A sudden storm blew in from the hills, unexpected and sharp. Clara waited by the window, heart sinking with every hour that passed. He came back just before dusk, soaked and shivering, blood trailing from a deep gash on his arm where barbed wire had torn his coat. Clara's hands didn't shake as she cleaned the wound. She'd grown too used to emergencies now. But her throat tightened with every moment she spent wrapping his arm. Seeing the pain he refused to show. "You shouldn't have gone out alone," she scolded gently. "I've done it 100 times, he said, his voice rough. "I didn't expect the weather to turn so fast." "You could have frozen," she whispered. Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her. "Would you have cared?" he asked quietly. Clara straightened. "Of course I would have." "No, I mean," he swallowed hard, then said it. "Do you care, Clara?" Her breath caught. She sat beside him on the edge of the bed, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think you wanted me to." "I didn't think you did. I did. I do. But I didn't want to ask more of you than you were ready to give." "I gave you everything the day I stepped off that train," she said, tears in her eyes. "I just didn't know it yet." He reached for her then, gently, like a man holding something sacred. And when he kissed her, it wasn't passion that lit the fire, but tenderness. It was the kind of kiss that said, "You're safe now," and "I see you." They renewed their vows the next week, just the three of them. Clara wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself. Lottie scattered dried wildflowers along the porch while Daniel, in his best shirt, took Clara's hands and said, "Simply, this time, I'm marrying you because I love you." "And I'm staying," Clara replied, "because I love you too." No crowd, no music. Just family. Chosen. That night, Clara tucked Lottie into bed. The little girl yawned, then looked up sleepily and said, "You're Mama now." "For real?" Clara smiled, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. For real." As she stepped outside to sit beside Daniel under the stars, Clara looked out over the land, her land now. Her home, her family. She had come west terrified and alone. But she'd found something stronger than fear. She had found love, and she had found herself.